to once again focus on their inner life and basically on the salvation of their soul. This is the only thing that really matters. All the rest is purely secondary.
All right. Hello and welcome to the Ordo Restituta podcast. My guest today is Professor David Engels, historian and lecturer at the ICES and the author of the book Das Abendland verteidigen, Defending the West. His book examines the deep civilizational crisis that is facing the West, and he proposes a way forward, a vision that he calls Hesperialism, rooted in the classical and Christian heritage of Europe. Today, we'll discuss not just the West's decline, the dialectic of history, the idea of a European civilizational state, but also the possibilities for renewal. Professor Engels, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm already looking forward to discussing about all these subjects with you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. You have written and published, certainly the German version of your book. It's called Das Abendland verteidigen, Defending the West, or more precisely, Defending Abendland. Why did you write the book, and what has the response been so far?
Well, the origins of that book, they rather lie in the original, that is the French version. I had been asked beginning of last year, by the French publishing house Salvatore to publish a book presenting a more alternative vision of a strong Christian but united Europe in the wake of the elections to the European Parliament last year. And so I was very happy about that occasion, because then that gave me the possibility to condense a lot of articles and papers and thoughts I've had during these last years. During these last years, I've also edited a couple of collective volumes about Hesperialism, about a more, let's say, a patriotic approach towards European identity. And so I was very happy to compile all these different approaches into one book that had been published then I think it was in April last year, under the title Défendre l'Europe civilisationnelle. And of course, as usual, when I publish one book in French, I always think about the translation in my German mother language and the other way around. And so I started quite quickly to write also a German translation. Even though I have to admit that I've always been a bit scary about the German reception, because the French reception has been extremely positive. So there have been a lot of discussions and also interviews, even in mainstream media, and basically, let's say, the more moderate, as well as the more, let's say, openly Christian and patriotic people quite found something in that book. So it was very nice discussion about that. However, Germany, as you know, is a very special field. Once you are not within the political left, you are already considered as being far right. And if you are far right, then basically your life is over, and so forth. And so I'm looking with a bit of apprehension to the German reception, because I'm quite sure that many of the points I'm trying to make are certainly not really acceptable by the more leftist establishment. And so who knows what this gives and what the reception of that will be. The book as now as we are speaking is just been published. I've not yet even have it in my hands. So I know that many people have already received it, but I have not yet received my author's copies. But of course, as you already said, also when it comes to the title, you translated it as Defending the West. In German, it is Abendland. In French, it is Europe civilisationnelle. So that already shows that there is a certain problem in not necessarily defining, but at least putting a word on the term and on this notion of how we should call our civilization and how we should define this civilization.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it is difficult. I mean, if you want to translate it literally, it is defending Abendland. That's what it is. But for maybe an American audience as well, I mean, they will probably know much better what we mean when we say defending the West, but actually it is defending Abendland. Yeah, right. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, it's a very, very recommendable read. It's a very concise book. I mean, you basically condense your thoughts into like 120, 30 pages, but still. What I love about it, it's a very perceptive analysis, even though the chapters and the sub-chapters are maybe like 2, 3, 4 pages, very perceptive, a lot of substance there. And I would want to say the proposal you have for a possible renewal in the future is very, very compelling. And I want to add one more thing as well. I think that much of what you write is just common sense. I mean, you won't find many radical ideas in there, extreme ideas. Certainly they're missing, which is very, very good. Now, the first question I guess I have to ask when it comes to the content of the book is this. How would you describe the civilizational crisis that we're facing in the West, and what are the root causes?
That is, of course, an enormous question. So we could speak about many hours about that. But yeah, I mean, in the media, especially in Europe and in Germany, you very often have these very selective approaches towards the crisis. People think that it's about migration. No, it's about demographics. No, it's Donald Trump. No, it's the Russians. No, it's Islam. No, it's the disindustrialization. So there are a lot of, let's say, very, very simple explanations of this crisis, and they're all false, of course. I would say, and I'm trying to show that in the book also, that it's about the civilization in crisis. It's not a crisis that is coming from the outside. Of course, we are faced as Europeans and as Westerners with a lot of pressure from the outside. We can speak about Islam, about migration, about China, about Russia, whatever. But I think that the main part of that crisis is an inner crisis. It's a civilizational crisis that is also not absolutely new or unexpected, as you and perhaps also some of the the public may know. I'm very strongly influenced by the thought of civilizational comparativism, Oswald Spengler, Arnold Toynbee, people like that, who tried in their works to show how all major civilizations go through very similar phases. And that is also the reason why many years ago I wrote a large book on the analogies between the crisis of today's Europe and the crisis of the late Roman Republic in the first century BC, trying to show that basically all the ingredients are the same, like mass migration, like demographic decline, like the decline of religion, like globalization, like social polarization, technocracy, crisis of the family, and so forth and so forth. They are all basically only symptoms of what happens basically to all late civilizations. We are going through a phase that has these different symptoms. And if we ask about the roots of that crisis, I would say that these roots, they are not accidental. They are in a certain way predetermined. Now, of course, I'm already in the middle of the subject, so already somewhere perhaps that is already a bit heavy stuff for the listeners. But I would say that all civilizations, they go through a couple of very parallel phases, and like there's a first phase where a civilization tries essentially to transfer its insight into transcendence in everyday life, in politics, and tries to shape society, politics, art, institutions, economics, and so on and so forth, following this very specific vision of the transcendence it has. Then we have generally some form of antithesis, you could say, where God is replaced by the human being, where it's not anymore about theology, but it's about technology, where it's not about interiority, but rather about exteriority and expansion, and so forth. And I think that we currently are at the apogee of this antithetical movement. The antithetical movement that starts, I would say, somewhere around the 16th century. Basically, when the Holy Roman Empire collapses as a major player, when Christianity starts, or Catholicism starts to split because of Protestantism, when the nation state rises, when also the Americas are discovered. From that moment onwards, you could say that there is a switch basically from a civilizational vision that is based on unity and transcendence to one that is rather placed on the human being, on relativism, on expansion, and so forth. And so what is happening today, this civilizational crisis, is not an accident. It is the culmination of something that has begun in the end nearly 500 years ago. And from that point of view, I know that may shock perhaps some of the listeners, but from that point of view, I think that modern wokeism is, from a certain point of view, the logical result of Renaissance humanism. Renaissance humanism that started perhaps still as some form of tragical and heroic project that tries to rectify some of the real errors also of that time, but that switches from the idea that there is an absolute truth to the idea that truth is finally a human production, and that homo mensura, that it is man who is the measure of all things. And once you accept that, you enter a certain form of relativism that leads ultimately, once its civilizational basis is eroded, like today, to total nihilism as we live it today. And so I think that is precisely the point where we have to situate the modern West.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, one very quick thought is when one accepts your explanation, which I do, I mean, it becomes very clear that there isn't just a political solution, a simple political solution making. I mean, we know that in our democracies, I mean, every election is the most important election of our lifetimes. But the thing is that we cannot just vote ourselves out of that dilemma. I mean, there are the roots are very deep, half a millennium, and basically, I mean, the point you make is that history can be understood dialectically. You have a thesis, this a holistic worldview that unites the dogma of the church and philosophy. I mean, you see this with the scholastics, with Thomas Aquinas, especially in the West. And then the antithesis, you have rationalism, fragmentation, and then you're also saying, and basically the antithesis has exhausted itself at this point, and the next step would be a possible synthesis. Would you be happy to speculate how such a synthesis could possibly look like in the future?
Yes, with pleasure. I mean, all this is a very limited insight in a much more complex structure. We have to perhaps to inform also that well, at my university, the ECS, I'm basically teaching world history. So it's not so much about the West, but about all the other civilizations also. And basically this more dialectical approach towards history can be found in all other civilizations too. You can understand classical antiquity through it. You can understand Egyptian history, classical Chinese history, Indian history, and so on. So this model and this model is not fundamentally new. Also, I mean, already Hegel tries to show how dialectics can be understood not only in order to understand human history as such. And I don't buy that, basically. I don't buy that human history has this dialectical approach, but he also applies it to different entities like nations or civilizations and so on. And I think he has a point, and basically that corresponds also to many of the subdivisions you can read in people like for example, Giambattista Vico, and of course Spengler and Toynbee we already mentioned. So my approach is not, let's say, totally new, but rather is also tributary to all these important predecessors, which is why I have a certain confidence also that this model, even though we spoke about that now in a very simplified way, really holds and really can help us to understand civilizations. And so indeed, that also makes it possible to predict history from a certain point of view, not in the details, of course, but still when it comes to the general movement. Exactly as well, if you have understood how human life functions from the birth to death, there is a very high chance that once you see a human being you don't yet know, that you can predict basically the different stages through which he will go until his death. So I think that applies, that is also applicable to other life forms and essentially civilizations. And so indeed, we are living now at the tipping point where the antithesis, this humanist, relativist, nihilist, purely materialist antithesis, is leading itself to the absurd, ad absurdum, you could say. That is already what many people are seeing today. That basically with wokeness, we have reached a point where it simply becomes ridiculous. You can't take that serious anymore because it is so obviously wrong on so many levels that that it is losing its substance by the day, basically. And what we also have to add to that is that wokeism, by its reinterpretation of notions like of important and very positive notions like democracy and equality and justice and minorities and so forth, is discrediting these notions. Because today we are living in systems that are democratic in name, but that in reality have not much to do with what the Greeks once thought about when they created this idea of democracy. And you can say that about basically all the other points. And so there is a new generation rising that is saying, well, if democracy and justice and equality and minority protection is what I see in my everyday life on the streets, then all these concepts are ridiculous and devoid of any sense. And that explains why it will be not only difficult, but probably impossible to just go back a little bit in time, like so many, especially liberal conservatives, think they could do. They think, well, there were some errors in the 90s, and so if we rectify what went wrong in the 90s or 2000, we can go back to the good old 1980s where everyone was happy and where we could have our cake and ate it. So where we could have liberalism on the one hand, but still a bit of traditional, solid, civilizational structures on the other side. But going back in time, 20 or 30 years, that doesn't function. That is why I think that there is this tipping point moment that is approaching, where this entire antithesis is just starting to become ridiculous. And that is when a synthesis, a civilizational and final synthesis, is possible. Now, how could such a synthesis look like? I studied that a lot when I compared, especially, of course, the present moment to the late Roman Republic, but I also wrote a lot about analogies with ancient China and Iran and Egypt and Islam, Muslim world. And basically, you see that in all these cases, we find a sort of synthesis between the two major ideas that precedes the synthesis. That is, on the one hand, the tradition of the thesis, and then the reason, ratio, of the antithesis. And so I think that the synthesis will be based on a rational return to tradition. That is, it will not just be a return to tradition and let's go back basically to the faith of the Middle Ages and start all over again. No, because we are modern beings. We can't undo modernity. We see its problems, but we won't simply all start like the Amish people, switch off the internet and going back basically to the Middle Ages. That might be very sympathetic as a solution, but we won't do that. So it will be rather a synthesis between both. And I think that already now many people, based on a reasonable and a rational analysis of the current situation, are realizing that without reintegrating elements of tradition. And when I speak of tradition, I speak about tradition in the widest sense, or not just folklore, but tradition in the term, also the sense of religion and of family and so forth. That people are starting, that it makes sense. It makes a rational sense to just drop this relativist and nihilist faith in the omnipotence of the human mind, and once again accepting that there is something higher, something we won't criticize, something that is absolute, and that only if we reintegrate this sense of tradition and transcendence into our life in a rational way and combining it with ratio, that we can save basically what remains of our civilization. And this synthesis is something you see in all other civilizations. You see it, without going too much into the details, but in what happened in Rome after the civil wars with the Principate of Augustus, who is the embodiment of the rational return to tradition. You can see it also with the first Chinese empire under the Han. I'm not speaking about the Qin, but about the Han Empire, which basically does the same project. The Fatimids go very well into that sense also, the Renaissance in Egypt. So you can go basically through all the major civilizations, and all the time you see there is this antithetical phase, there is this culmination point where basically reason leads itself, as such at least, to the absurd, and where people, at least an elite, realizes we need to go back to tradition in a reasonable, rational way if we want to save our civilization. That is why I expect this for our nearer future of the next 10 or 20 years. It may depend from one country to the other, obviously, but that is how I would think that our future may look like.
Right. And I think we are seeing certainly the beginnings of that. I mean, I think over the last 10 years, especially, of course, I mean, the internet, social media has accelerated that process. But over the last, I would want to say 10 years, we have seen massive changes in the attitudes of people, especially young people, but not exclusively young people. Yeah, I think that's right. You have proposed a vision in your book that you call Hesperialism. And I would like to ask, what is, in very broad sketches, obviously, what is Hesperialism and how does it relate to the Holy Roman Empire?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Just to confirm what you said, obviously it's especially in the US, where you have seen it during these last years, an enormous acceleration of this return to tradition. Much more, I think, than in Europe. Now in Europe, you also have big differences, like France, for example, where this process of young people rediscovering tradition, and that means, of course, rediscovering also traditional Christianity, and especially traditional Catholicism is in full sway. There are many movements now in France where this rational return to tradition is the program of the day. This is, of course, something that the mass media, especially the boomer generation, have not realized and are probably unable to realize. But there is a huge civilizational shift that is happening, and many things that are unthinkable for the older generation are things that are nearly of a certain banality to young people. Yeah. And so, yeah, Hesperialism, well, and it relates to what I just said, that there is a problem, especially in Europe, that especially the middle-aged or the elder generation very strongly clings to the idea of the good old nation state of the 1980s. And so they see, they associate the numerous failures of the European Union with a general failure of the European unification process. So they think, and they are not wrong, that the European Union is one of the major powers behind imposing things like LGBTQ ideology, gender ideology, mass migration ideology, disindustrialization ideology, civilizational masochism, and so on people. And yeah, unfortunately, the European Union has been taken over 10, 20 years ago, certainly by a certain majority that is very clearly left liberal, that is becoming increasingly woke, and that is basically transforming the European Union into the worst enemy of what the European project once was about. That is glorifying our future, explaining to the our past, and of course projecting itself into the future, explaining to the people why they belong together as a civilization, defending this European space against the numerous enemies on the outside, and creating some form of commonwealth. And all that, of course, is turned upside down by the modern European Union, which is why so many people say, well, this was a wrong idea, so we have to go back to the nation state. One nation already did it. It's the United Kingdom, of course, with Brexit. And of course, the Brexit has already shown the problems inherent in classical sovereigntist nationalism. That is, that we have seen very clearly that even if we get rid of Brussels, basically, if people continue to work to vote for the same elites as they did in the United Kingdom, nothing has changed. Mass migration hasn't changed. Economic decline hasn't really strongly changed. The decline of population hasn't changed. The masochism of hating one's own civilization and history and so forth hasn't changed. So going out or leaving the European Union as such is not a solution if the same elite remains in place. And I'm also strongly convinced that on the long run, if we would imagine that the European Union would be dissolved and we would return to 30 plus states within the larger European space, then we would go to a situation, or we would end up in a situation where we would have again everywhere tax barriers, rivalries, people starting to fear that the Germans might take too much place, so the Czechs and the Poles would ally with the US, whereas the Germans would ally with Russia, and the French would perhaps ally with Qatar, and the Italians would be bought by the Chinese. And so basically all would start once again to compete with each other, and basically they would become just satellites of the other big world powers, these civilizational empires that are emerging everywhere. And so I understand the nostalgia of many nationalists and sovereigntists, but I don't think it's a good solution to the civilizational crisis. I think that the European Union, the European unification process is a wonderful instrument. It could be an instrument for defending our civilizational space, for imposing also our rightful place in the world, of protecting our identity and so forth. And that is why I have proposed for many years by now this medium solution of Hesperialism, which is some form of third solution in comparison to conservative nationalism on the one hand, and the more woke Europeanism that is a false Europeanism, as it is basically rather globalism than really Europeanism in its civilizational core. And so Hesperialism would be then an expression for certain cultural and civilizational patriotism that, from a certain point of view, would of course be first limited to our immediate European space, but that, because of history, extends from a certain point of view to the entirety of the Western world, which includes, of course, also the Americas and Australia and South Africa and so forth. So it would be some form of civilizational patriotism that we are lacking for the moment, and that would not be based on the usual references to human values and the different international rights and so forth. They are, of course, also important. I would never speak against them, but they are not sufficient, because it is something that we can also find in Japan and South Korea or any other states, which also defend basically the same human values than us. So we need to rather a certain form of patriotism that is not a human patriotism or an enlightened, globalized patriotism, but a more precise civilizational patriotism. That is why I call that Hesperialism, to give it a more original stamp. And that I hope that on the long run, and I see already first signs of that, especially young people start to understand that, yes, you can love your nation state, but that doesn't mean that you cannot recognize that there is this overarching civilizational structure of Europe, and that it is on that level for the moment that the nation state is defended. So I would end this in the perhaps paradoxical, but I think very important notion that if we really want to defend the European nation states, we need to do that on the European level. If we go just back to the nation state, then basically we risk not only Europe, but we risk the nation state itself.
Thank you very much for the explanation. I think that there's so much in there. I mean, I want to just add one or two observations of my own. Basically, what you're saying is, there are two options at the moment. There is the left liberalism of the European globalists who want to make the EU into a place without a place, really, where there is no common European identity, but a globalist identity, right? And then you have the nationalists. They want to go back to the nation state, as you said. But I like making the point that the nation state nationalism in itself is a liberal project. It comes from the French Revolution, as I don't have to tell you that. Obviously, but people. They think that nationalism is the traditional conservative solution to the problems, but it really is a liberal idea. And so basically going back to the Holy Roman Empire, and you're well aware of this idea of the Respublica Christiana, Abendland in German. And I think it is a very Christian solution, and I think you make the case that the left idea, the leftist idea isn't tenable. The right wing, quote unquote, the right liberal idea, we should call it, isn't tenable. It really is the only game in town, so to speak. There's no other option. And so basically, what we have here is this idea, and you put it beautifully in the book. You say that Europe's goal should be a common defense against common enemies. And you mentioned the other civilizational states, China, Russia, maybe even the US. We'll see the future development there, maybe India. And I think you also mentioned Brazil and at one point. But then freedom, subsidiarity, and tradition on the inside, and then remaining faithful to our heritage, which includes many things: the Old Testament, the New Testament, the classical antiquity, also the Enlightenment as well. And basically Hesperialism is kind of a melting pot of these ideas, a rational melting pot of that. Am I right about that?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's good that you recall this idea of the Sacrum Imperium of the Holy Roman Empire, because this is indeed for me the most important example on which the future Europe should model itself. That the European Union for the moment has this problem that it is extremely weak on the outside. It's a laughing number. Nobody takes the European Union serious, perhaps from an economic point a little bit, but also there's an enormous decline. But when it comes to political presence in the world, to military power or so, the European Union is simply ridiculous. So the European Union is unable to defend our borders. To the contrary, it is even inviting in millions of people of uncontrolled migration. It cannot project its power outside. It has no access to strategic resources. It is absolutely dependent on China, on the US, on Africa, and so forth for that. So it is inexisting as a global power, but to the inside, it can be very authoritative. There's this running joke, many of the American listeners and watchers will perhaps not be aware, but what the European Union really managed very well during these last years is producing these bottles with the capsules on them that you can't take off, but that are somehow attached to that for climate reasons. And this is something that the European Union has managed in a very short time, and you can't find any normal bottle anymore except those imported from China, where you can just take off this capsule. So this is the kind of thing the European Union is managing and imposing. And it is imposing that in a very authoritarian way, in a very efficient way. And I would say that we need to turn that upside down and rather take as an example for the future European Union or Federation, or however we will call that, not this Kantian, rationalist, very Prussian and bureaucratic approach, but rather the traditional approach towards European unity, and that is the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire who precisely could be and was during many centuries strong on the outside, but extremely free on the inside. So you had an enormous notion of subsidiarity to the inside, whereas the emperor was always there to defend the outer borders. So this is something the European Union should also be. It should be able to defend the European space against the outward world, but it should also assure its freedom and subsidiarity to the inside world. And that is why the Sacrum Imperium is so important, even more so as, of course, it is not just an imperium, but also a sacrum imperium, that is an empire that comes with a mission. And this mission, during the Middle Ages at least, was indeed to unify Western Roman Christianity in some form of defensive bloc. So it had this very strong commitment also to tradition, to transcendence, to a certain vision of the afterlife, of what God is about, of the church, of our family structures. And that is also why I choose for the illustration to the German version of my book the very famous throne of Charlemagne from Aachen. Aachen, who was, from a certain point of view, the first capital of the post-Roman Holy Roman Empire, and that was a model city built by the first European emperor, by Charlemagne. And in the center of this magnificent cathedral, you had this throne that was built very probably from slabs imported from Jerusalem, from slabs that come probably from the Holy Sepulchre church, and the throne that is in itself already a reliquary. So that shows really this strong link between the notion of imperial authority, but on the other hand, of a transcendent legitimation of that power. And I think that a Europe that is now continues to not only being neutral in religious terms, but that is openly hostile against Christianity while it favors all the other religions, such a Europe is doomed to decline. So of course it cannot be, that is typical for this idea of rational return to tradition. Of course, we cannot now start to impose Catholicism or Christianity on people living in Europe and putting people on the stake because they're Protestants or Muslims or Buddhists or whatever. That is not the aim. But the aim would be to once again enshrine in our understanding of what Europe is about and what also European Union should be about, a very high estimate and respect for Christianity, not only as a religion, but also as a civilizational force that has built Europe. Thinking you could think Europe without Christianity is, even from a historical point of view, absolutely rubbish. I mean, for more than a millennium, Europe and Christianity were terms or Western Christianity at least, that were basically interchangeable. All our European history and civilization, even when it comes to the rejection of religion, remains deeply Christian. Even our atheism is a Christian atheism. It is very different from Chinese atheism or Indian atheism. So we cannot escape Christianity. We are built by Christianity. We are products of Christianity, and at the same time we have ourselves also formed Christianity. So rejecting that and saying that from now on Christianity is a private affair that doesn't really enter into any form of consideration of defining what we are and what we want to do, is, from my point of view, an enormous error, as already the founding fathers of the European communities have realized. If you already read Robert Schumann and others of the founding fathers in the 50s, very clearly thought this European project needs to be rooted in our tradition and in Christianity, and deviating from that path was an enormous error that is leading our civilization to the brink of disaster, but of course also something that from a longer perspective was more or less inevitable, because all late civilization have this phase where they reject their own religious traditions. And that is why I'm quite confident that this idea of reintegrating positive references to the Christian tradition, to Christian civilization, is inevitable and will be at the core of this rational return to tradition. And this, by the way, something we can already follow very closely now in the US, where this is basically on the order of the day as a program.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Christian nationalism is the term there, and basically, we've talked about nationalism and the era of nationalism, but maybe in the US it's different, because the US is a civilizational state. It's not Germany, it's not France. It's much bigger in terms of population and economic output and everything. But the thing is, what they are trying to do, they're trying consciously to fuse a civilizational identity with Christianity, and in many ways, although I have my criticisms of Christian nationalism, it is maybe, and you would certainly agree with that, the logical next step, and probably the first step in the coming synthesis. Right.
Yes.
Now, I want to ask you what practical steps a Hesperialist Europe would need to take. I mean, you've talked about the I think in the book you call it awakening a sense of the divine, basically putting Christianity at the center of things again, at the center of our moral principles, of our politicians' moral principles. We have a brief discussion about the separation of church and state. We make very good points, but what other steps would we have to take if we want to further this project?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, because I am less and less convinced that we will be able in Europe to reach that form of Hesperialist agreement without major upheavals. I mean, it's always my dream, of course, that my books, and I mean, I'm not the only one that is thinking along these lines, but it's always my wish that yes, one day or the other, as well, some decent people from the left, and there are many of them, as well as decent people on the right side, may understand that okay, we need to go back to that form of European patriotism if we want to really avoid the worst. But I'm not so convinced about that, unfortunately. I think more and more that Europe is set on a very problematic course in terms of economy, in terms of ethnic clashes, in terms of institutional structures. And I'm not sure if Europe will avoid a long phase of civil unrest, unfortunately. And I'm not saying that is a warmonger or something secretly hopes that. We know that this is a catastrophe. I mean, I'm living now once again in Belgium, and I'm traveling a lot to France, and it's palpable that there's this tension that is rising, that you have so many conflicts, not only between right and left, but also between migrant population and autochthonous populations, between the big cities and the countryside, between the rich and the poor. There is such a tension in the air, and especially France is a country that is really at the brink of disaster. I mean, you already saw it during these last weeks and months, how France is becoming basically ungovernable, and this is not just due to Emmanuel Macron. It is a systemic problem. This is probably, France is probably the country that is the farthest in this present day evolution, and it is in a form of aporia, of a situation that cannot be resolved anymore from the within, because you have this center that is leftist liberal center that is eroding. You have such a strong extreme left, Then you have, of course, also the nationalists and the patriots around the Front National or Rassemblement National that is so strong. And it is more or less impossible to imagine how these different groups will find any form of peaceful solution together. Then, of course, you have a state where already most of the big towns are totally in the hands of Muslim migrants and of African migrants. So where there is not any, let's say, autochthonous population anymore, with so many people fleeing the big cities and going to the countryside. So France is really in a state of, let's say, in a state of effervescence and of pre-civil war. And I'm using that word because Emmanuel Macron regularly speaks about the risk of civil war. And once France becomes ungovernable and once civil unrest becomes endemic, as it is already nearly now, then the rest of Europe will follow. Then suddenly the European economy won't be worth a dime, basically. So all people will disinvest, and there are many people who will benefit from the fact that Europe isn't anymore a big player in the economic and political arena. And so that may take many years, but also I think that in the end, this may be also, as always, some form of creative moment where there's a lot of destruction and of sadness and of horrors. But it may also be a moment when people go back to what is essential and notice that all this wokist ideology and all this moral supremacy and this arrogance and this total lack of understanding about how the world functions, about how other civilization functions, where people will start to realize their errors and start to be perhaps a bit more humble, a bit more realistic, will understand what is really necessary, what is not, will perhaps start again to feel also like a solidary community. And understand that basically all Europeans are sitting in the same boat within that crisis, and that perhaps from such a moment may arise then some form of new moment that could create such a Hesperialist movement. But I know, of course, that referring to civil unrest and crisis as a motor for change is always a bit cheap, because it could be better to say, okay, this are the next step, and then we will be there in a peaceful way. And I would sincerely hope so, but I don't think it. I fear we will have to go through that, and we will see, of course, in comparison to the Roman civil wars, who basically had the same systemic problem, the same systemic failure, to what degree it will be possible to reach such a civilizational state for Europe in a way that will still respect our democratic core values, for which I sincerely hope, or to what degree this will be more and more the result of a certain military environments, like, for example, the system that Augustus, with his Principates, had to found. Because Augustus, I don't think that, I mean, this form of Principate government in Rome, of a certain traditionalism and conservatism imposed by Augustus was unavoidable, but the fact that this had to be based on a very strong authoritarian military regime, I don't think that was unavoidable. I think that had the Romans a bit earlier already understood that their system was doomed to fail, and had they perhaps listened a little bit more also to Cicero and to the ideas that he explained in his De Republica, then perhaps the Roman Empire might have avoided people like Nero or Caligula or so forth, and might have looked like much more, let's say, republican from the beginning. And that is why I sincerely also hope for Europe that our transition to such a state will happen, let's say, in a more organic way, and will not have to be brokered by violence. But the longer it takes, and the longer also the woke system is trying to keep to power and to impose ever more censorship and authoritarianism and streamlining of the school system, and the more they're putting people in jail, or are shadow banning them, or are discrediting them, or are just chasing them from their jobs, closing down bank accounts, and are putting everywhere cameras and so forth. I mean, the more and more they will do that, the bigger will be the risk that there will be this counter movement that might then be as authoritarian as they are doing that now. And I'm a helpless spectator to all that. I can only try through this ideal of Hesperialism, trying to show that this might be a way out to which history seems also directing us, but through which concrete means we may reach that. This is something that I have no command over.
Right, but what I want to say is really we are seeing kind of the return of very strong political figures. I mean, you have someone like Orban in Europe, and he's the mildest form. I mean, you have people like Donald Trump, you had Bolsonaro in Brazil, and then obviously there are people like Modi, Xi, and Putin. I mean, and also Bukele in El Salvador. I mean, it's around. Yeah, right. I mean, it's a very, very tiny country, but still, I mean, people like Bukele, Xi, Putin, I mean, they will not leave until they're dead, effectively, or until they're deposed. I mean, they are very, let me say, monarchical figures almost, and we're seeing the return of that, absolutely. But on a more positive note, I mean, what signs give you hope for Europe's future? I mean, talk has been quite, I'm not going to say gloomy, but I mean, realistic in many ways, but I mean, there are signs of hope. What are they?
I would say that the major sign of hope is this expectation of a final synthesis, because many people, when they, especially in Europe, when they think about their historical moment, they rather think about the end of the Roman Empire. So many rather think, well, we are in the 5th century AD, so we are witnessing the fall of our entire civilization, the beginning of a new barbarism. So I would say that is, especially on the right-wing spectrum, the general analysis, while I rather see us in the 1st century BC. So that would mean that we still have some quite nice centuries perhaps before us. I mean, there will be a civilizational and a paradigm change, obviously, that will happen. But it's not yet the end. I think the West has a lot of possibilities still ahead of it. So from a perspective of my approach towards the philosophy of the history, it's not the end. To the contrary, there might be still a very important and quite positive perspective ahead of us. And of course, on the other hand, or in addition to that, I think that the rediscovery of faith is something really important, and that is happening right now, especially with the young people. I would say in the 80s or 90s, basically, you could think that Christianity was dead, or rather reduced to some form of basic social ritual without any deeper belief. Those people who, for example, within the Catholic Church, rather preferred to reject the Second Vatican Council and went rather back or conserved the ancient Mass, they seem to be these irreconcilable, angry old men that would sooner or later die out. And today we see exactly the contrary. We see a church where basically the more traditional it gets, and the more you have young people with many babies and wonderful families and people who are full of hope, not hope in the political sense, but hope in the sense that they are fighting the good fight, that they are on the right side of history, and that it's not about succeeding or not in their political fight, but simply about the reality of being within the faith, founding their families, having their kids, educating them, trying to live in an environment that is beautiful, to be within a framework that makes sense. And the number of these young people is steadily growing, especially in France, but it's a movement that is slowly taking on a certain dimension, whereas the mainstream churches are basically empty, and the medium age of the people is somewhere on 60 something. So nobody is taking that serious anymore. So this is, I think, quite a positive sign that we have overcome this phase of pure cynicism and nihilism that was so strong even in the 90s. I mean, if you look now in the TV series of the 90s, of the 2000s, the degree of cynicism, of nihilism, of self-hate, of egoism is so breathtaking. Basically, I mean, it's wrapped up in a little bit of humor and some nice jokes and some nice physics, but basically it's a total emptiness that we had at that moment. And I can understand that people even thought, well, this is the end of history because we have reached the last man of Nietzsche, basically, not the last man of Fukuyama, but the last man of Nietzsche, where basically history is at its end because it has reached its lowest point. That is changing. So we see a certain form of renewal, a new form of interiority, also of faith, of value of as I said, of family, of nation, of beauty, of friendship, and so forth. And I think that is a positive evolution. And of course, the way the US are going for the moment also inspires a lot of hope. I mean, we can of course answer or ask the question: well, are figures now like Donald Trump, are these now the examples that we would like to give to our children from a conservative point of view? Would anyone now say, kids, once you are great, be like Donald Trump? I'm not absolutely sure. At least in Europe, people would rather than refer to for example, to Saint Louis in France, so to medieval figures like King Arthur, for example. That would rather be the people we would like to follow, to be like. But it's starting. It's slowly starting that these examples are emerging, and I'm very positive and optimistic that we will have these figures that will rise again. Of course, in a period of big civilizational crisis, you already mentioned it. We are entering, from a morphological point of view, rather the period of Caesarism, with people like Donald Trump, like Elon Musk, for example, Abendland Vance, being all these Caesarist individuals that will start to, that are not yet there in the new form of organization, but that are not anymore within the old framework, and there will be a lot of competition. I think that once Donald Trump is not in office anymore, it might be possible that we might see a lot of competition and rivalry within the Republican movement, something that may correspond, for example, to what happened, but without the Civil War, I hope, after the death of Caesar, when we also had people like Mark Antony and Octavian and Lepidus and so forth, trying to see who will be the successor. So there is certainly a certain tradition and transition to a new system. But in the end, there are, I think, signs of hope. But these signs of hope, they come especially, I would say, from this interior perspective, and the fact that politics is not anymore only about socio-economic indicators and these kind of boring and purely materialist stuff, but rather also about higher values. That is something, this reintroduction of a transcendent dimension into politics, something I would strongly welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the main, or maybe the main question of politics today is the question of identity. That's basically what your book is about. Absolutely. What advice would you give, especially young Americans, young Europeans, I mean, in particular, but Westerners, young Westerners in general today, who might be watching?
Mm-hmm. Well, I wrote an entire book about that. Basically, it was this book called Was tun in the German language, Que faire in French. It has been translated into a dozen of European language, but not English. I'm not sure why, but most of my books have been translated into the most obscure languages, I might say so, but never into English, which is really bizarre. So I still have this hope that, especially Was tun, what is to be done, might one day also be available in the English language. And that is a book where I tried in 24 chapters to answer exactly to that question. And I already mentioned some of these points. I mean, finding back your way to transcendence, founding a family, having kids, trying to have a job that, or to give sense to your job, even if you are working in a field that might perhaps not be the one you always dreamed about, but at least finding sense or certain fulfillment in doing your duty, choosing your battleground, and not wanting to do everything at the same time, but thinking very coldly and rationally about where you could make a difference, trying to link yourself, to network with other people who have the same beliefs as you, trying to create your own parallel societies that could withstand the storms that might be coming very soon, trying to invest in let's say in a responsible way when you buy something or when you have to deal with money, always thinking about the long term and not just the short term. Also understanding that mainstream society and mainstream media has lost its moral authority, and that as Christ put it, you have to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but to God what is God, and that there are certain values that you can't compromise about, and that if the state creates a situation where it imposes upon you something that obviously is morally bad, that you have not only the right but even the duty to refuse and to be opposed to that. And of course, creating a system of solidarity with others, where people help each other, so that they are not left alone against this machinery, not only of the state but also of the woke, empty society. And of course, and I think that is something I'm more and more influenced by, the absolute priority of the interior in comparison to the exterior. Because I think that many Christians and many conservatives anyway have fallen prey to this more leftist conception that basically it's all about matter. It's all about social stuff. It's about the economy. It's about creating an ideal political society. So it is very immanent as an approach. And many conservatives also try basically to fight their fight on the battleground that is in its concept very leftist. And conservatives have forgotten that what defines them is not just being, let's say, defending the values of the past against the progressives. No, it's to the contrary. The fact that for us, the absolute point of reference is not an ideal society, some form of social utopia here and now, but rather is natural law, is the fact that human being is that the human being is a creation of God, and that our main point of reference lies outside of that world. Socialists and many conservatives, unfortunately, are very immanent now, whereas from my point of view, ideal conservatism would focus on the fact that no, our destiny is somewhere else, and so this world is not the end of it. It is a necessary framework for the state we are now in, but it is not about living the best possible material life while you are here, but rather organizing already now your life in order to be oriented towards absolute values and towards what is in the future. That is what lies behind what is called that. And this should be the point of reference, and also for individual life. And so that means that that once you're on your deathbed, you will not be judged on the fact, well, did your political party win any victory? But you will be judged on the fact, were you close to God? Did you manage in this life already to live a good life, that is a life that is oriented towards transcendence? And that is something we can't just skip out of that by saying, yes, well, but this good life can only be lived once we have assured the victory of our political moment and imposed a socially ideal conservative state, and then we will have the life we want to have. No, we have to live following our convictions and under the absolute primacy of transcendence already now. Because normally a conservative, and especially a Christian, should know that there is no ideal life in this life here. We are living in the civitas terrena, and it is the proper of this life of being deficient, of not being ideal, of being full of sorrows, because this is meant also to help us. It is meant also to help us growing and to develop within ourselves this focus on transcendence. And I fear very often that many conservatives are not at all in this paradigm anymore. And I can't repeat it enough. And I think that especially for young people, the sooner they manage to turn their view on reality upside down and act and feel from the inside rather than from the outside, and care about their inner life and their individual closeness to transcendence and to God, instead of just being a militant and activist for whatever conservative and positive values, the better it would be. So this would be, I'm not sure if I expressed this very clearly, but this would be the main lesson I would want to give to people, to once again focus on their inner life and basically on the salvation of their soul. This is the only thing that really matters. All the rest is purely secondary.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very good way to end. Professor Engels, it's been a wonderful conversation. Before we go, please tell the audience where they can find you and what you're working on right now.
Oh yeah. Well, people can find me quite easily on the social media. I'm on most social medias, especially of course on X, where my profile is David Engels 12. So I've also a small YouTube channel where people can also find me quite easily and follow my work. And for the moment, well, there are two main projects. On the one hand, I wrote a novel some time ago. We've tried to find an editor for publisher for that, because it's a novel precisely about these subjects, and it's semi-autobiographical, but at the same time it reflects a little bit all these discussions we now had in a more or less realist setting within different conservative milieus. So this is something I hope will be published quite soon in the French language, which is the language I used for that text. But the other, the big project, you could say, is that I moved to Belgium. I left Poland, where I lived for 7 years, and now we are building up a small institute for integral education here. So we are trying to set up seminars and lectures and so forth in a Hesperialist sense, but not only from a political perspective, but also about knowledge, about faith, about God, about tradition, about our European history, about parallels with other civilizations. So we're in the middle of renovating something that would house this institute, and of course, there are many news to follow once all this is ready, and I would be really happy to welcome you and of course the spectators to the events we are already planning now for next year.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, and I'd be delighted to be there. I will put all the links to your books, to the relevant books, in the description box below, so people can find them there. Also links to your X profile and to your YouTube channel and your personal website as well. And to the listeners, as always, if you enjoyed this episode, please like and share and subscribe. It helps a lot. And join me next time on the Order Restituta podcast. Thank you for watching.